The emergency sirens blared through the ship's cabin as Marcus Thompson fought with the failing controls. Red warning lights flashed across the dashboard, indicating multiple system failures. His small transport vessel, caught in the gravitational pull of an uncharted planet, was rapidly descending through the purple-tinted atmosphere. Come on," he muttered, trying to stabilize the ship. The gravitational forces were much stronger than anything he had encountered before. His military training kicked in as he ran through emergency landing procedures, but the dense atmosphere was making it nearly impossible to maintain control. Through the view screen, he could see vast forests stretching out below him. The trees had strange, dark purple leaves that seemed to absorb the light from the planet's 3 suns. 2 of the suns were setting on the horizon, casting an eerie twilight across the landscape, while the 3rd sun still blazed overhead. The ship's hull groaned under the pressure as it cut through the thick air. Marcus could feel the heat building up around the cabin. Warning signals indicated the outer shell was beginning to break apart. He had maybe 2 minutes before total system failure. Scanning the terrain below, he spotted a clearing near the edge of the forest. It wasn't ideal, but it was his best chance for survival. Marcus directed what remained of the ship's power to the landing thrusters, hoping to slow his descent enough to survive the crash. The ground rushed up to meet him. At the last moment, he activated the emergency crash webbing, which wrapped around him like a cocoon. The impact was devastating. Metal screamed as the ship plowed into the ground, carving a deep trench through the alien soil. The cockpit window shattered, and debris flew everywhere. When the ship finally came to rest, silence fell. Marcus hung upside down in his safety webbing, his head throbbing. The air that rushed in through the broken window was thick and humid, making it slightly harder to breathe than Earth's atmosphere. He could taste something metallic on his tongue. With practiced movements, he released the webbing and carefully lowered himself to what was now the ceiling of the inverted cockpit. His survival training immediately began cataloging his situation. He was alive, with no major injuries, just cuts and bruises. That was the first piece of good news. The second piece was that his emergency pack was still intact, strapped securely to the wall. It contained basic survival gear, a water purifier, emergency rations, basic medical supplies, and a multi-tool. It wasn't much, but it would help him survive the immediate future. As Marcus crawled out through the broken window, he got his first real look at his surroundings. The gravity was noticeably stronger than Earth's. He estimated about 1.3 times stronger. Every movement required more effort, and he knew this would drain his energy faster than normal. The air was thick with strange spores or pollen, giving everything a slightly purple tinge. The clearing his ship had carved out was surrounded by massive trees, their trunks as wide as buildings. The purple leaves above formed a dense canopy that filtered the sunlight into odd patterns on the ground. Something moved in the shadows of the forest. Marcus froze, his military instincts taking over. He caught a glimpse of something large slinking between the trees, much larger than any Earth predator. Its movement was silent despite its size, and he could see the light reflecting off what looked like armored plates on its body. Another movement caught his eye from a different direction. There was more than one. They were hunting him. Marcus quickly grabbed his emergency pack from the wreck and assessed his surroundings. The crash had created a scatter field of debris, some pieces large enough to use as temporary shelter. About 50 meters away, he spotted what looked like a rock formation that might offer better protection. As the second sun began to set, the shadows grew longer, and the movement in the trees increased. Marcus knew he had to make a decision fast. With no weapons and no real understanding of the threats he faced, his only option was to find shelter and survive the coming night. He had been prey the moment he crashed, but Marcus Thompson had no intention of remaining prey for long. The first week on the alien world taught Marcus more about survival than his 15 years of military training. The cave he'd found became his sanctuary, though calling it a cave was generous. It was more of a deep crack in a rocky hillside, but it served its purpose. Using broken pieces of his ship's hull, he had created a makeshift barrier across the entrance. It wasn't pretty, but it kept the local wildlife out. The real challenge had been dragging the metal sheets up the hill in the planet's heavy gravity. Every task took twice the effort he was used to, and his muscles ached constantly. Marcus sat at the cave entrance, watching the strange world through a small gap in his barrier. He had started keeping a log of the predators' hunting patterns. The largest ones, which he called stalkers, hunted mainly during the triple sunset, when all three suns aligned on the horizon. Their armored bodies gleamed with a metallic sheen, and they moved with frightening grace despite being the size of small cars. But it was their hunting method that fascinated him. On his third day, he had noticed something odd. The stalkers ignored warm rocks in the sun, but instantly turned toward shaded areas that held heat. They were heat seekers, but with a twist. They detected heat signatures that stood out from the background temperature. That's why they're so active at sunset, he muttered to himself, making notes on a salvaged data pad. When everything's cooling down, warm bodies stand out more. This discovery had led to his first real breakthrough. Marcus had found deposits of a strange, crystal-like mineral in the cave that stayed cool even in direct sunlight. By grinding it into a paste and mixing it with mud, he created a crude form of thermal camouflage. It wasn't perfect, but it helped mask his heat signature. His next challenge had been food. The emergency rations wouldn't last forever, and he needed to understand what was safe to eat. He had developed a system, watching which plants the smaller herbivores ate, and then testing tiny amounts on his skin before trying microscopic tastes. After 5 days, he had identified 3 edible plant species. But plants alone wouldn't be enough. He needed protein, and that meant hunting. Marcus spent hours studying the smaller prey animals, which he called runners. They were about the size of deer but had 6 legs and tough, leathery skin. They survived by being faster than the stalkers and staying in open areas where they could see danger coming. Today was going to be different. Today, he would make his first hunt. He had prepared carefully, coating himself in the cooling paste and creating a crude spear from a sharp piece of his ship's frame. The key wasn't going to be speed or strength. He couldn't match the local predators in either. His advantage was his mind. Marcus had noticed that runners wouldn't cross certain areas where particular purple flowers grew. Through careful observation, he had realized these plants released a scent that marked stalker territories. He had collected these flowers and created a trap, placing them in a rough circle with a single gap. Now he waited in his blind, constructed from local vegetation and ship debris. His body was coated in cooling paste, and he stayed perfectly still. A group of runners approached, grazing cautiously. They detected the flower boundary and began moving along it, exactly as he had predicted. The lead runner stepped through the gap, and Marcus made his move. He didn't try to chase it. That would have been pointless in this gravity. Instead, he had positioned himself between the runners and their escape route. His sudden appearance startled them, sending them bounding away from him, straight toward the cliff wall he had selected. The panicked runners found themselves trapped between the cliff, the flower boundary they wouldn't cross, and Marcus. In their confusion, one young runner separated from the group. That was all he needed. His spear flew true, striking the creature in its side. For the first time since the crash, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was learning to live in this world. The stalkers might rule this planet, but they weren't the only ones who could hunt. As he prepared to collect his kill, he noticed something interesting. The other runners hadn't scattered completely. They stood at a distance, watching him with what seemed like curiosity rather than fear. Something about their behavior was different from when the stalkers hunted. He didn't know it yet, but this was the first sign that he was changing the natural order of this alien world. Marcus had been tracking a new group of runners when he found it. The animals had led him farther from his cave than usual, into a valley he hadn't explored before. At first, he almost missed it. A perfectly straight edge poking through a curtain of purple vines. Nature didn't make straight lines. His heart began to beat faster as he brushed away the thick vegetation. Beneath it was a wall, made of some kind of dark metal that hadn't corroded despite the planet's harsh environment. The surface was smooth except for a series of raised patterns that looked intentional, writing, perhaps, or decorative designs. "I'm not the first intelligent life to walk here," he whispered to himself, running his hand along the ancient surface. The wall stretched for several meters before disappearing into a hillside. Marcus followed it, applying his cooling paste out of habit. The stalkers rarely came to this area, but survival had taught him to always be cautious. As he rounded the hill, he stopped dead in his tracks. Hidden by the dense forest and years of growth was the entrance to what had once been a massive structure. Vines and tree roots had broken through parts of it, but the building's basic shape was still clear. It reminded him of Earth's ancient pyramids, but made of metal instead of stone, with sloping sides that rose at least 50 meters into the air. Marcus approached carefully, testing each step. The entrance was partially blocked by debris, but he could see that the interior was hollow. He pulled out the small light from his emergency kit and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a corridor that sloped downward into the earth. The air inside was stale but breathable. His footsteps echoed as he made his way deeper into the structure. The walls were covered in the same patterns he'd seen outside, but here they were more elaborate. Some sections seemed to glow faintly when his light passed over them. The corridor opened into a large chamber filled with what could only be technology. Rows of dark panels lined the walls, and in the center stood a pillar covered in glowing symbols. Despite being ancient, something in here was still drawing power from somewhere. Marcus approached the central pillar carefully. His time on this world had taught him to respect the unknown. As he got closer, the symbols began to shift and change. It was responding to his presence. A hologram flickered to life, filling the room with a soft blue light. Images began to play across the walls. Scenes from the planet's past. He saw cities rising from the forests, vehicles moving through the air, and beings that looked nothing like humans going about their lives. But then the images changed. The three suns drew closer together in the sky. Strange lights filled the atmosphere. The planet's wildlife began to change, growing larger, more aggressive. The cities emptied as their inhabitants fled to the stars. They left because something was coming, Marcus realized, watching the recorded history play out. Something that changes everything on this world. He spent hours in the chamber, studying what he could. The technology was far beyond his understanding, but he began to grasp the basic story. The civilization that built this place had discovered a pattern. Every few thousand years, the planet's three suns aligned in a specific way, bathing the world in intense radiation. This triggered rapid evolution in all living things, changes that happened in weeks instead of millennia. Rather than face this transformation, they had chosen to abandon their world. But they'd left behind these facilities, recording stations to observe and document the changes. Marcus checked his makeshift calendar. Based on the movement of the suns that he'd been tracking, this alignment wasn't some distant future event. By his calculations, it would happen within months. A sound echoed from the corridor. Something was moving in the structure. Marcus quickly shut off his light and pressed himself against the wall, applying a fresh layer of cooling paste. Heavy footsteps approached the chamber. In the dim light from the hologram, he saw one of the stalkers enter the room. But instead of hunting, it seemed to be watching the images. The creature's behavior was nothing like he'd seen before. It stood perfectly still, its armored head tilted as if studying the scenes playing out on the walls. Marcus held his breath. He wasn't just learning about the planet's past. He was watching its future evolving before his eyes. The question was, would he survive to see what this world would become? The stalker never saw the trap coming. Marcus watched from his hiding spot as the massive creature stepped into the narrow ravine he'd spent 3 days preparing. The ancient facility had taught him more than just history. It had given him ideas. He had taken crystalline panels from the ruins and arranged them in a specific pattern, creating a maze of heat signatures that confused the stalker's natural hunting ability. The creature's head swung back and forth, trying to make sense of the thermal readings that seemed to be coming from all directions. Marcus pressed a salvaged button from his ship's control panel. The makeshift trigger activated, and heavy metal sheets from his crashed vessel dropped down behind and in front of the stalker, trapping it in the ravine. The sound echoed through the valley, sending flocks of bird-like creatures scattering into the purple sky. The stalker roared, a sound that would have terrified Marcus 2 months ago. Now he watched calmly as the creature slammed against the metal barriers. They held firm. He had tested their strength against the planet's gravity repeatedly. "Let's see how you like being trapped," Marcus muttered, thinking of all the times he'd been forced to hide from these predators. But he wasn't going to kill it. He had a different plan. Using a long pole made from ship debris, he carefully placed a chunk of meat near the trapped stalker. The meat was coated in a paste he'd made from local plants, the same ones that marked stalker territories. He had discovered that the scent didn't just mark boundaries. It could influence behavior. The stalker, despite its anger, couldn't resist the meat. As it ate, Marcus watched its movements become slower, less aggressive. The plants weren't poison. They were more like a mild sedative, something the original inhabitants had probably developed. Over the next few hours, he fed the creature more treated meat, watching as it gradually became calmer. By sunset, the stalker was lying quietly, watching him with what seemed like curiosity rather than hunger. When Marcus finally opened the barriers, the stalker didn't attack. Instead, it slowly walked away, occasionally looking back at him. He had done more than just survive an encounter with the planet's apex predator. He had changed its behavior. Word spread quickly in the animal kingdom. Within days, other stalkers began avoiding his territory completely. The runners, which had already grown somewhat accustomed to his presence, started grazing closer to his cave. Smaller creatures followed, seeming to recognize that the area around his home was safer than the open forest. Marcus began expanding his territory, setting up more of the crystalline panels in strategic locations. He created safe corridors through the forest, places where the stalker's hunting abilities were confused by the heat signatures he engineered. The panels, powered by the same mysterious energy source as the ancient facility, became his most valuable tool. He built more traps, not to kill but to teach. Each trapped stalker received the same treatment, calm exposure to his presence combined with the scent-marked food. Some became almost docile, while others simply learned to avoid him. Either way, the balance of power was shifting. One morning, he found a young runner lying injured near his cave, suffering from what looked like a stalker attack. Instead of seeing easy prey, Marcus spent hours treating its wounds with healing paste he'd made from local plants. The runner stayed even after it healed, creating a new dynamic he hadn't expected. The runners began leaving their sick or injured near his territory, seeming to understand that he would help them. Each healed animal added to his growing influence over the ecosystem. The stalkers might still rule most of the planet, but in his expanding territory, Marcus had created something new. A place where intelligence and cooperation mattered more than raw strength. As he stood at the entrance of his cave, watching the complex social interactions of the various species below, he realized something profound. He wasn't just surviving anymore, and he wasn't just a hunter. He was becoming something this world had never seen before, a protector who could think, plan, and change the very nature of predator and prey. But in the sky, the three suns were slowly moving into their fateful alignment, and Marcus knew that everything he had built would soon be tested in ways he couldn't imagine. Marcus stood in the ancient facility's main chamber, surrounded by holographic displays he'd finally learned to control. 3 months of studying the alien technology had taught him to recognize basic patterns in their language. The central pillar hummed with energy as it showed him records of the last great change. "So that's why they left," he muttered, watching the historical records play out. The three suns' alignment wasn't just a light show. It triggered something in the planet's core. The radiation penetrated deep into the ground, activating dormant genetic codes in every living thing. The images showed creatures transforming within days. Plants developed new defenses, herbivores became carnivores, and predators evolved into even more fearsome forms. The previous civilization had fled rather than face this rapid evolution, but they'd left behind detailed records of each cycle. A noise drew his attention. One of the younger stalkers he tamed, he called it Scout, had followed him into the facility. The creature watched the holograms with unusual focus, its armored head tilting as images of its ancestors played across the walls. The recordings showed that stalkers had once been much smaller, more like Earth's wolves, before previous solar events had changed them. "You're going to change too, aren't you?" Marcus said to Scout, who had become a constant companion. The stalker's intelligent eyes met his, and not for the first time, he wondered just how much these creatures understood. He turned back to the control pillar, pressing his hand against a section that glowed brighter at his touch. New images appeared, showing maps of underground chambers beneath the facility. The previous inhabitants had built shelters to observe the changes from safety, but they'd never used them, choosing to leave instead. Marcus began copying the facility's data onto his salvaged ship's computer. He discovered that many of the symbols matched patterns he'd seen on the stalker's armor-like scales. The connection was obvious now. The stalkers weren't just predators. They were the planet's dominant species in waiting. Each solar event had pushed them closer to true intelligence. A warning signal flashed across the displays. The alignment was coming sooner than he'd calculated. He had only weeks, not months, to prepare. Moving quickly, Marcus gathered the crystals he'd been studying. The previous civilization had used them not just for power, but as a way to channel and control the evolutionary radiation. He'd been experimenting with smaller versions, creating protective fields around his territory. Outside the facility, he found several runners waiting. They no longer feared the stalkers in his presence, and they helped him carry equipment back to his cave complex. Over the past months, he'd expanded it into a network of connected chambers, using techniques he'd learned from the ancient records. His territory had become a strange sanctuary. Runners grazed peacefully, while stalkers patrolled the boundaries, not as hunters but as guards. Smaller creatures had built nests in the safety of his walls. He had created a new kind of ecosystem, one based on cooperation rather than pure predation. But would it survive what was coming? Marcus spent the next days setting up crystal arrays around his territory, copying the patterns he'd seen in the ancient facility's designs. Each array had to be precisely aligned with the others, creating a web that would help control the coming changes. Scout watched him work, sometimes helping to move heavy equipment by carrying it in its powerful jaws. The stalker's behavior had become increasingly complex, showing problem-solving abilities that both excited and worried Marcus. If the stalkers were already this intelligent, what would they become after the evolutionary surge? As he worked, he noticed other changes. The purple plants were growing faster, developing new patterns in their leaves. The runners were becoming more organized in their movements, forming complex social groups. Even the air felt different, charged with potential. At sunset, Marcus stood at the entrance of his cave complex, watching all three suns draw closer together in the sky. Scout stood beside him, both of them observing the strange new behaviors of the wildlife below. Tomorrow, they would begin moving everyone into the underground chambers he'd prepared. "Whatever we become," Marcus said to his alien companion, "we'll face it together." The third sun blazed brighter than ever, and the wait was almost over. The sky turned a deep crimson as the three suns aligned perfectly for the first time in millennia. Marcus stood at the entrance of his underground shelter, watching the final groups of animals enter the protection of his crystal arrays. Even the air seemed to shimmer with strange energy. "Last call," he muttered, scanning the horizon. Scout, the stalker, stood beside him, calling out with a deep resonating sound that echoed through the valley. The remaining creatures, runners, flying beasts, and even other stalkers, hurried toward the shelter entrance. The first wave of radiation hit like a physical force. Marcus could actually see it, ribbons of colored light that twisted through the air and ground. The crystal arrays he positioned lit up, creating protective domes of energy, just as he planned. But the power was far stronger than anything the ancient records had shown. "Everyone inside now," he shouted, though he knew most of the creatures were already responding to Scout's calls. The stalkers' vocalizations had become increasingly complex over the past weeks, almost like a language. They barely made it inside before the second wave hit. Even through the thick walls and crystal protection, Marcus could feel the energy pulsing through everything. The animals huddled together in the large chambers he prepared, predator and prey side by side, all instincts forgotten in the face of this greater force. Scout suddenly collapsed, its armored body shaking. Marcus rushed to the stalker's side, but there was nothing he could do. All around the chamber, creatures were undergoing similar convulsions. The runner's legs were changing shape, the flying creature's wings were shifting, and even the smallest animals were transforming. Through the observation windows, Marcus watched the outside world transform. The purple forest seemed to melt and reform. Trees grew to impossible heights in minutes, their leaves splitting and evolving into new shapes. The ground itself rippled like water as buried life forms responded to the radiation. Then the pain hit him. Marcus fell to his knees, his vision blurring. He had known this might happen. The radiation affected all living things, but he'd hoped the crystal barriers would protect them from the worst. Through the haze of pain, he saw his hands changing, the skin hardening in patches, becoming more resistant to the planet's harsh environment. Hours passed like years. The chamber filled with sounds of transformation, cracking bones, stretching tissue, and cries of pain that slowly changed pitch and tone as vocal cords evolved. Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness, aware that his own body was adapting in ways he couldn't control. Scout's body had grown larger, its armored scales developing intricate patterns that pulsed with bioluminescence. The stalker's eyes had changed too, becoming more expressive, more intelligent. Other stalkers in the chamber were undergoing similar changes, their forms shifting to accommodate larger brains and more complex nervous systems. The runners were developing defensive capabilities, their once soft skin hardening into scaled armor, their legs becoming more powerful. Some had grown additional sensory organs, their heads reshaping to house new ways of perceiving the world. Through it all, the crystal arrays held, their energy helping to guide the changes rather than prevent them. Marcus realized this must have been their true purpose, not to stop evolution, but to direct it towards stability rather than chaos. The final wave of radiation was the strongest. Marcus felt his consciousness expanding, connecting with the crystal technology in ways he hadn't thought possible. The ancient facility's knowledge flowed into his mind as his brain evolved to comprehend it. He understood now why the previous civilization had fled. They had feared losing themselves in the change. But Marcus didn't fight it. He embraced the transformation, letting it reshape him into something that could truly survive in this world. His senses sharpened beyond human limits, his muscles densified to handle the heavy gravity, and his skin adapted to filter the harsh atmosphere. As the three suns began to separate in the sky, the chamber fell silent. The great shift was ending, but its effects were only beginning to become clear. Marcus stood on shaky legs, looking at the changed beings around him. They were no longer simply animals, and he was no longer simply human. They had all become something new, something this world had never seen before. And somewhere in the back of his evolved mind, Marcus knew that the real challenges were just beginning. 3 months after the Great Shift, Marcus stood at the peak of his mountain territory, surveying the transformed world below. His enhanced vision could now see clearly for miles, picking out details that would have been impossible for his old human eyes. The purple forest had become a complex metropolis of interconnected life forms, with trees that responded to thought and plants that communicated through pulses of light. Scout stood beside him, no longer just a tamed predator but an equal partner. The stalker had grown to twice its original size, its armor now covered in patterns that glowed with conscious thought. They communicated through a mixture of sounds, light signals, and the subtle telepathic bond that all survivors of the shelter had developed. Another ship approaching, Scout communicated, its thoughts clear in Marcus's mind. They both looked up at the streak of light cutting through the atmosphere, the third human vessel to arrive this month. Marcus touched the crystalline growth that now covered parts of his skin, a living armor that had evolved from his work with the ancient technology. His body had adapted perfectly to the planet's conditions, becoming something that was neither fully human nor fully alien. The first rescue ship had arrived 2 weeks after the shift, responding to his crash beacon. They'd found something very different from the lost human they'd expected to rescue. Marcus remembered their shock at seeing him standing calmly among creatures that their scanners said should be deadly predators. Below in the valley, the changed runners moved in complex social patterns, their new intelligence expressed through graceful dances of movement and light. They had developed a symbiotic relationship with the smaller flying creatures, which now served as their eyes in the sky. Every species had found its new place in the evolved ecosystem. "They're asking for landing clearance," Scout indicated, picking up the ship's communications with its enhanced senses. The stalker's language skills had developed rapidly, along with its understanding of human technology. Marcus sent a response through the crystalline communication array he'd built from the ancient facility's technology. "Granted, but they must follow the approach path. The forest is sensitive to engine emissions now." The ship adjusted its course, following the safe corridor through the living forest. Marcus had established clear rules for human visitors. They could observe, trade, and learn, but this planet was under his protection. No exploitation, no colonization, and absolutely no hunting of the evolved species. Some called him a traitor to humanity. Others saw him as a bridge between worlds. Marcus didn't care about either view. He had become something more than human, adapted to be a guardian of this unique world and its inhabitants. The ship landed on the designated platform, a living pad of specialized plant matter that could handle the heat of spacecraft. A group of scientists emerged, their environmental suits unnecessary in the atmosphere that Marcus had long since adapted to breathe. "Welcome to New Eden." Marcus greeted them, using both verbal speech and the light patterns that now covered his skin. Behind him, a group of evolved stalkers and runners approached, curious but not fearful. "I hope you're ready to learn." The scientists stared in wonder at the harmony before them. Predator and prey, human and alien, all transformed into something greater than their original forms. Their instruments clicked and whirred, trying to make sense of the impossible ecosystem that had emerged. Scout sent a private thought to Marcus. "They fear what they don't understand, just as the ancient ones did." Marcus nodded. "Then we'll help them understand. That's why we're here." Above them, the 3 suns shone down on a world that had transcended the old laws of nature. Marcus had arrived as prey, become a predator, and emerged as something even greater, a guardian of evolution itself. The planet had changed him, but he had changed it too, creating a place where intelligence and cooperation meant more than tooth and claw. As he led the amazed scientists into his living fortress, Marcus smiled. Somewhere in the universe, the civilization that had fled this world might still exist. He hoped they could see what their world had become, not a place to fear, but a testament to the power of adaptation and the strength that comes from embracing change rather than running from it. The story of prey becoming predator had ended. The story of predator becoming protector was just beginning.